for joining us.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. You're now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field. And now, he's your host.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And we're back. It's great to have once again the great Roger Joseph Stone. He is a political consultant, campaign advisor, lobbyist, and he's been in politics since the 1970s. He's worked for Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Jack Kemp, Bob Dole, George Bush, of course, Donald J. Trump. He served for many years as a lobbyist of Donald J. Trump and his casino business. In fact, he first suggested to Donald Trump to run for president in 1998. But in 2019, he was arrested on January 25th, part of the Mueller investigations. And in November 2019, he convicted by a jury of 7 felony counts. And July 10th, 1920, just before he was scheduled to appear to prison, his sentence was commuted by Donald Trump, and then he was pardoned. So welcome back to the program. Good to have you back again.
Zev, it's great to be with you. I do have to add one thing to your lineup. We also learned through a lawsuit that the U.S. Justice Department was forced to disgorge Robert Mueller's final report regarding my investigation. And it proved that the judge withheld exculpatory evidence from my defense attorneys that proved beyond a shadow of doubt that I was not guilty. So I was subjected to a Soviet-style show trial. But even Mueller could not sugarcoat in his final report, which he had kept redacted and tried to avoid publicly releasing, but for the order of a federal judge, he found no evidence of Russian collusion, WikiLeaks collaboration, or any other crime on my part. I was persecuted to pressure me to testify against Donald Trump, which I refused to do. And the Lord heard my prayers. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that the president unconditionally pardoned me, because the internet manages to hide that fact. You have to actually go looking for it. Anyway, great to be back with you, Zev.
Forward to your book. When is it coming out? Your book is coming out about your ordeals. You almost were penniless. It really was terrible to go through the whole process.
Yeah, I must tell you, I've written 5 books. I've written, obviously, a New York Times best-selling book on the Kennedy assassination, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, in which I make a case that there's a much broader, I hate this word, conspiracy that involves the CIA, organized crime, Big Texas Oil, the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Pentagon in the murder of JFK. I've written 2 books on Richard Nixon, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Richard Milhouse Nixon, the greatest friend Israel ever had, a man who, as you know, unilaterally, personally saved Israel from total annihilation in the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
We told me
Objections of Henry Kissinger,
right?
Objections of his own national security apparatus, airlifting $37 million worth of lethal aid to the Israelis, who had their backs to the sea after a surprise attack by the Syrians and the Egyptians. And then, of course, I've written a book on the Clintons called The Clintons' War on Women. That's probably what actually got me indicted. I've written a book called The Bush, A Crime Family. But candidly, all those books were relatively simple to write. Not that they weren't time-consuming. They were. But the writing about your own situation, while you would think that it would be cathartic, it's really not cathartic. It forces you to relive this horrible incident. Recognize that I was charged with a first-time nonviolent white-collar crime, yet 29 heavily armed FBI agents stormed my home at 6 o'clock in the morning, brandishing fully automatic M4 assault weapons to arrest a 68-year-old man who has no passport, who has no previous criminal record, and who is easily identifiable. So the idea that I was a flight risk and that I had to be arrested in this violent manner is absurd. And of course, when they took me in to be arraigned, they didn't even ask for a cash bond. So if I were a flight risk, why would they not have asked me to post bond. My wife, who is deaf, woke up looking down the barrel of 2 assault weapons. She didn't know whether we had a home invasion. She had no idea what had transpired. You're right. We lost everything: our home, our savings, our insurance, my car, my prized electric guitar. I had to sell everything to raise the money for my legal defense. But although I may be materialistically poorer today, I must tell you that I am spiritually much richer today because I renewed my faith in God, and God saw me and my family through this horrific ordeal.
So let me ask you this question. America incarcerates more people than any other country on earth today. Since you have Donald Trump's ear, are you going to try to get prison reform and also reform that situations such as yours shouldn't happen?
Well, he's already made great strides in that area. The law, of course, which has generated the greatest mass incarceration of poor people and Black people in this country, is the 1994 crime bill. This was written by Joe Biden as the Senate chairman. It is the bill that and signed by Bill Clinton. It is the law that requires the harsh mandatory penalties for the first time nonviolent crime of possession of small amounts of drugs for personal use. Now, I'm not excusing drug abuse, but people who meet that description belong in drug treatment programs, not in expensive incarceration. We're not talking about hardened criminals with repeat offender records. We're talking about average people, let's say the mother of 3, the single mother of 3, working 2 jobs, arrested with a small amount of marijuana in her purse. She should not face, a multi-year harsh mandatory penalty, and judges should have discretion. You see, under the 1995 crime bill, judges have no discretion. They can't look at an individual situation and to decide that some mercy is called for. So yes, in the First Step Act and the Second Chance Act, 2 landmark pieces of criminal justice reform, both conceptualized and pushed and signed by President Trump, we've already made great strides in this area. I am hopeful that he will do more. However, I do have to note that when that legislation was before the House of Representatives, a majority of the members of the Black Congressional Caucus voted against it, which makes no sense because this has been their position for many years. They voted against it simply because it was being proposed and supported by President Donald Trump. To me, that seems extremely hypocritical.
No, absolutely. We do hope that there'll be more prison reform, reformation of the DOJ. I think we're going to see a lot. Did you believe that President Donald Trump would win again? Because I know that there were periods of time when, especially when Kamala Harris entered the race and Joe Biden exited, where they felt that, hey, momentum was going the Democrats' way.
Yeah, I never believed any of that. If you go back and look at my comments, I'm a veteran, as you know, of 13 national presidential campaigns, starting with Richard Nixon, 3 campaigns for the great Ronald Reagan. I worked for Senator Bob Dole, one of the greatest men of the 20th century, would have been a great U.S. president. I did my party duty for George W. Bush when I worked on the recount, but I am not and will never be a Bush Republican. And you're right, I was among the first people in the country, if not the first person, to urge Donald Trump to make a serious bid for president. That was actually as early as 1988, but then again more seriously in 2000, then again in 2012, and then ultimately in 2016. All you had to do was to study the polls immediately after Biden was essentially forced out of the race by Barack Obama against his will. I think that's pretty clear now. And you saw these polls that showed a surge in support for Kamala Harris. But if you studied the polls more carefully, you would see that in every case, they purposely oversampled Democrats to get a desired result. Now, it's interesting that at the various conferences that are held after the election, that her own handlers admit that at no time did they have her leading Donald Trump, and that at no time did they have her in their own internal polling leading her in any of the swing states. At the same time, you had a separate psyop going on in which millions of dollars are flooding into her campaign in small contributions through a payment processing function called Act Blue. Now, it's interesting. Act Blue, you can give by credit card, but they turn off that requirement that your mailing address match your credit card number. And therefore, I could prove to you, and I will prove here shortly, because this is not the only instance of it, millions of dollars that flowed into her campaign came from donors who do not exist, or who, when you contact them, specifically deny having made multiple credit card-based contributions to Kamala Harris or any other political candidate. This is a massive multi-million-dollar scandal that will get fully exposed here over the next 6 months.
Our guest is Roger Joseph Stone, who's in the 1970s and beyond. He's worked with all Republican candidates, presidents, Nixon, Reagan, Kemp, Dole, Bush, of course, Donald J. Trump. And he was convicted, but was pardoned by Donald Trump. By the way, your ancestry includes Hungarian and Italian heritage. Any Jewish blood in you?
I'm Catholic on both sides, but I may have been Jewish in a previous life. I must admit, I love a great pastrami sandwich. So maybe,
maybe that's a dilemma. You mentioned before that Ronald Reagan was the best friend to Israel. People say Donald J. Trump was. So how would you compare the two when it comes to Israel and the Jewish people?
Actually, you just misstate that. What I was saying was that Richard Nixon was a great friend to the people of Israel. Now, there is no question that in the White House tapes, you can find him making derogatory comments about Jews. I don't deny that. But there is no question that in 1973, due to a failure by Israeli intelligence, there was a lightning attack on Israel by the Egyptians and the Syrians. And they were very quickly out of ammunition. Golda Meir sent an emergency message to President Richard Nixon, appealing to him for lethal aid. They literally had their backs against the sea. It's interesting because Dr. Henry Kissinger, who was himself Jewish, of course, was opposed to involvement. The National Security Council was opposed to involvement. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were opposed to involvement. Their argument was that aid for Israel would unnecessarily provoke the Russians. Nixon overruled all of them and ordered that $37 million worth of lethal aid be airdropped to the Israelis. Now, it's interesting. They don't ever play this White House tape for you. All of this was captured on tape in the famous Watergate tapes. Now, there are those who worked for Nixon who knew that sometimes if you disagreed with an order that he gave, if you would delay, you could sometimes get him to re-examine that order. So the very next day, Nixon asked Kissinger, have the Israelis received the aid yet? And Kissinger says, no, Mr. President, it actually hasn't been sent. And Nixon asks him why. And Kissinger explains that the Pentagon can't decide what kind of an airplane to send it in. Nixon calls Admiral Thomas Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and says to him, this is a near quote, if this aid is not in the, he says, send anything that will fly. I don't care, he says, send anything that will fly. If this aid is not out the door to Israel within the next hour, I'm coming over to the Pentagon and I will put my foot up your ass. It's a direct quote.
And that's on tape.
That's on tape. Of course, you never hear that tape played. I'll go with Golda Meir, who says that deeds are more important than words. So, yes, I think at a minimum, Nixon was a pivotal president in the survival of Israel. Does not in any way denigrate the accomplishments of Donald Trump, whose great accomplishments are obvious. First of all, unlike previous presidents who pledged to move the embassy, he actually moved the embassy. And the bureaucrats and the folks at the State Department and the Arabists all told him that this would be a disaster, that he couldn't possibly do it, but he pledged to do it, and he did it, and it was the right thing to do. And then, of course, there are the Abraham Accords, which is a major stride for peace in the region. So it would be hard to decide. They're both very great in their own individual ways. I would also point out to you, of course, that Trump's policy of harsh sanctions against Iran are what kept Hezbollah and Hamas from having the funding to launch the October 7th attack on Israel. It is only the decision by the Biden administration to unfreeze hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets to Iran, which ensured not only that the Iranians could restart their nuclear weapons development program, but also that they could finance Islamic terrorist attacks on Israel, which began October 7th and continue to menace Israel to this day.
No, absolutely. And he's been so strong in Israel. I hope UNRWA and all these other terrorist groups, and they get the message. I think even now, I see a sea of change in how countries, and look what's happening in Lebanon and Syria, Iran. I think they're all, listen, before the presidential election, Iran threatened Israel. Once Donald Trump won, no more saber rattling from Iran in that situation. I think they're taking notice.
Well, Hamas is already essentially calling for peace. Look, we both know the lesson of history, which is weakness provokes aggression. So whether you are the Iranians or whether you are the Russians or whether you are the Chinese, you see Joe Biden's weak response in Afghanistan. You see the fact that he withdrew our troops in a way in which he did not utilize the drone technology available to him to keep the Taliban pinned down. And the entire country collapses into the hands of the enemy upon their withdrawal. And as Donald Trump likes to point out himself, we leave 86 billion, that's with a B, $86 billion worth sophisticated military equipment behind. Equipment that is immediately sent out to China so that they can copyright it, so that they can pirate it. The world sees Joe Biden, what they see is weakness. This is what provokes Russia to attack Ukraine. That, plus the fact that Ukraine and the United States are in violation of two treaties that we signed, the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk Accord. Both specifically commit our country into not pushing Ukraine into NATO, which is defined as not mounting missiles on the ground in Ukraine pointed at Russia. Not to mention bioweapons labs, which you'll recall Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland blurted out and under oath in a congressional hearing do exist. Then she tried to walk it back and say they don't exist. There's more than enough evidence they do exist. So I understand it is the mainstream narrative of the press that the war in Ukraine is based on the territorial aspirations of Vladimir Putin. I just don't believe that's historically correct. I think this is very similar to the situation here in the United States in 1962, when the Russians mounted missiles in Cuba 90 miles from our shore. We did not react well to that. Putin has made it very clear that NATO missiles on the ground in Ukraine threaten his country, and that he would act if we insisted on continuing to push them. We have continued to push that concept. We announced previously, the United States, that NATO would accept Ukraine as early as September. That did not happen, but that is what this war is really about. Trump is right. If he were president, the Russians would never have dared invade Ukraine. He had already warned Putin about that. For that matter, Chairman Xi would never dare to move on Taiwan. You can see this in Trump's recent visit to Paris, where he saw virtually every important world leader there for the coronation of the new Notre Dame Cathedral. These leaders respect strength. They don't respect weakness. Weakness provokes aggression, and that is the sad story of Joe Biden.
By the way, some of the weapons at that Air Force base in Afghanistan ended up to Hamas. So that's, people don't realize that, but some of the weapons end up there. How often do you speak to President Trump?
Let's see. I see him a couple times a week. I text with him more often. It's my policy has been for 45 years not to discuss the content of personal conversations. But I must say he's in excellent spirits. I still think he's working too hard. I mean, he obviously put on a Herculean physical effort in the closing days of his campaign. This is very evocative of 2016. You know, in the closing days of that campaign, Hillary Clinton was so confident of victory. She was at her palatial home in Chappaqua going through swatches of fabric to pick out the curtains for the Oval Office. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was barnstorming Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Detroit, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and other Democrat strongholds. It's interesting because under the FAA regulations, a pilot can only fly a plane for so many hours consecutively before they have to stop for rest. So Trump just kept switching out the pilots. He would bring in new pilots so he could keep going. And the movement was so grassroots oriented, so organic, but also so powerful. He was able to say, for example, hey, call him in Milwaukee and tell him we'll be at the airport tomorrow for a rally at 10 a.m. And 40,000 people would show up. This is not an exaggeration. So I must say, as a veteran of 13 national presidential campaigns, Ronald Reagan, for example, one of my heroes, a man I worked for in 1976 when we challenged Gerald Ford, 1980 when we beat George Bush, 1984 when he was reelected. He was very, very, very popular and beloved, but he could not get 40,000 people at the airport in Wisconsin with 24 hours or less notice. So Trump is a natural phenomena. 40,000 people on the beach in Wildwood, New Jersey. New Jersey's a blue state in a blue region. So he's a natural phenomena. You'll never see anything like this again in American politics. And therefore, yes, I thought from the beginning that this could very much be the situation regarding Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, like Donald Trump, a New Yorker. Grover Cleveland, a conservative Democrat, served one term as president, was denied re-election in an election which his supporters claim was stolen, and then returned to the White House again. Other than that, it's never been done. Now it's been done twice, and Donald Trump did it. The other case I'd make is that this election, which was a landslide, meaning he carried every swing state, and he made deep inroads into traditionally Democrat states like New Jersey, New Mexico, even New York for that matter, surprising inroads, and changed things demographically. He won an absolute majority of Hispanic male voters. He came close to winning a majority of female Hispanic voters, deep inroads among Jewish voters, deep inroads among African American voters, very deep inroads among younger voters. What you have going on in the country, I think, is bigger than Republican Democrat. It's a realignment in which people who favor war, who favor censorship, who think that the big pharmaceutical companies should really do whatever they want, they are gravitating to the Democrats. It's ironic because the Democrats, when I was growing up, they were the party of peace. They were a party of civil liberties. They were the party concerned about government surveillance of private individuals. That seems to all have changed. Now we have a situation in which people of common sense, put party aside, just people of common sense, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Governor Rod Blagojevich, Democrats, yes, but people of common sense who are opposed to war, who favor free speech, and who want to take a hard look at the food industry in this country, for example, and whether we're being slowly poisoned by those who sell us processed foods, the vaccination regimen in this country, to ensure that it's safe and efficient. I had the polio vaccination. It's probably why I never got polio. I'm not anti-vaccination, but I do want to examine what's in some of these vaccinations, which seem to be key and tied to some childhood diseases. Trump said it best over the weekend. We just want to be sure. What's wrong with examining these things? What's wrong with a public examination of them? It's only reasonable, I think.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, I'm curious. In 2020, you were pardoned by President Donald Trump. And of course, he was criticized for it. What do you make about the whole situation where Hunter Biden was pardoned going back to 2014, and they're talking about pardoning other people who weren't even charged with a crime?
I think there's a material difference. As Robert Mueller was forced to admit in his report, which they hid from my defense attorneys, they wouldn't turn it over. I absolutely did nothing wrong. There is no violation of law here. So they charged me with a process crime. You can't lie under oath in your voluntary testimony about something that didn't happen. It's not even possible. Think about it for a moment. Now, people keep saying, oh, Roger Stone and his wife evaded $2.3 million in taxes. False. I reported every penny, my wife and I, that I ever made in my life, and reported all of my assets. I was sued civilly by the IRS over my inability to pay. You can't get blood out of a stone, pardon the expression.
Unless it's Roger Stone.
And this goes back, by the way, to my 2006 taxes. So yeah, I owe the IRS today $2 million. 400,000 of it is past due taxes. The rest of it is interest and penalties, which they will not negotiate any reduction in. Hunter Biden failed to report $10 million in income. Apples and oranges, very, very different. So also owning a gun while being on drugs is a federal infraction. So I really did nothing wrong. In his case, I think he broke multiple laws. Taking it all the way back to 2014, I would remind you, Zev, Vice President Joe Biden has no immunity for payments that he took from China, Russia, Romania, Ukraine, and elsewhere during his vice presidency. And I think the goal here was maybe misfired because Hunter has accepted a pardon. He now has no choice but to testify about those events during his father's vice presidency, or he will be jailed. In other words, he has no right to evoke the Fifth Amendment. So they may have outsmarted themselves. As far as a blanket pardon is concerned, Adam Schiff, Liz Cheney, Zoe Lofgren, Jamie Raskin, why would they need pardons if they did nothing wrong?
Good question. Will there be hearings once President Trump assumes office again?
I don't know that there will be hearings. A pardon is an executive action that can be given unilaterally, can be given today by Joe Biden. I'll be candid. I fully expect that before he leaves office, he will pardon his brother and other members of the Biden crime family who were receiving funds from foreign sources during his vice presidency and during his presidency. He has the power to do that. It is not subject to the approval of the Congress. President Trump said over the weekend he intends to pardon those who were charged on January 6th. And I believe he will do that. He has also said publicly that he would pardon Ross Ulbricht, who is the man who invented the dark web. The charges against him seem specious as well. He developed a technology that other people who he is not connected to use that technology to sell drugs. What does that have to do with him? If you invented the telephone and a drug dealer made a deal on the phone, are you responsible for that because you invented the telephone? Of course not. So I expect that you'll also see that pardon. Beyond that, I'm not certain what will happen.
Final question. Well, you mentioned your IRS problems with the interest and penalties. Will you influence, or is there any movement along the way to reform the IRS to make sure these kinds of things don't happen to other citizens?
Well, we certainly need IRS reform. I think that Mr. Long, the former congressman appointed the head of the IRS, is a good appointment. On the other hand, in the offer and compromise program, you're supposed to be able to negotiate a reduction in interest and penalty. Let's face it, Zev, I'll be paying the IRS monthly every year for the rest of my life. But for those who say Stone and his wife evaded taxes, no, actually, I made a payment 12 months a year for every year from 2006 until today, until I literally ran out of cash. When you have no money, you couldn't pay. So I'm afraid, unfortunately, I'll be paying them as long as I'm breathing. It's just the way it is.
I want to thank you, Roger J. Stone, political lobbyist, 13 presidents. He's advised, especially with President Donald J. Trump. Also talk show radio host on WABC. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to having you back again.
Folks can hear us every Sunday from 3 to 6.
Great show.
WABCradio.com. God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to
Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.